The first thing that we would say, the first exercise and tool that we ask groups or conveners to try is to, in some way, slow the conversation down. In a debate, the idea is to speak as quickly as possible. You know, the rapid nature of debate is intentional, trying to knock your opponent off their equilibrium. Things usually get louder, speed up. That's when that trigger starts to happen. And so an intentional slowing down of any kind of dialogue is really important. It helps people stay connected to those who the otherwise might really be shut off to. And so some ways to slow the conversation down. Number one way is to ask people to breathe, to pause in between speakers. We actually say 2 cleansing breaths or 2 deep breaths. If you have pairs of people grouped together, having one person have the floor and then pausing, and then the other person has the floor for the same amount of time. If you have a go-around structure or table conversations, asking people to pause in between people speaking, having one person speak at a time. Again, this intentionally slow conversation is actually really, really important. We have facilitators practice what Brene Brown talks about as box breathing, where you have 4 counts breathing, inhaling, hold for 4 counts, 4 counts exhaling and holding for 4 counts, as a way to really integrate strong emotions. So that would be for any kind of facilitator that you'd have. But any kind of way that you can slow the conversation down is a practical tool that really, really transforms the conversation. The next strategy for dialogue in the midst of conflict is to never start talking about people's opinions on an issue, whatever the issue is, whether it's political polarization. We never ask people to come and say, well, what's your opinion? That immediately sets up a debate, sets up kind of us versus them. Instead, the strategy is to start people with personal stories. So a key question there would be, what from your personal experience, or how does your personal experience inform the way you approach this topic? Can you tell a story from your personal experience that would help us understand your approach? Or what in your personal experience, or how have you been personally affected by whatever the issue is? So again, we ask people to get really, really personal. That is transformative because we've seen, say, in a gun debate or gun dialogue, not a debate, a gun dialogue that we were leading, we had people who might have been very kind of pro-gun, anti-gun debate had we set it up as a debate, but since we started them talking about their personal experiences and how those personal experiences led to their stance, whatever their current stance was, those initially very polarized people were able to say, had I had that same experience, I might actually come down on the side that you're coming down on. I still disagree with you based on my experiences, but I'm now humanizing you a lot more. I mean, they might not use those exact terms, but we see that over and over again in our dialogues with officers and residents. Officers, saying, wow, I had no idea that these youth were so dynamic. And after hearing from the youth talk about their personal stories, in the same way, youth saying, wow, I didn't know officers were real people. And so those are humanizing comments and they come out of having those stories be told. So taking time for personal stories is really important long before any kind of discussion of beliefs or opinions. Oftentimes after we ask people to talk about their stories, we'll then ask people to talk about their values. So what values do you have that drive you to care? So values like equality, love, freedom, And we have seen people very much opposed to one another actually be shocked that they had the same values, even though they had very different opinions on the issue. And that was a really important connection that they made. So starting with story, the third practical tool I want to talk about today is modeling curiosity. So that's a third strategy, and that can be for facilitators of a dialogue. That can be specifically related to the questions that are asked. This really comes into play when you hear something that is so shocking or outside of what your beliefs are, rather than saying something snarky or how in the world, or rhetorically put down, how in the world could somebody believe that? How in the world could somebody vote for somebody like that? You hear those kinds of statements all the time. Instead, the modeling curiosity would be, I'm going to pause you for a minute. I'm wondering what in your life experience led you to that belief. Wow, I have a really different belief than you do. What in your life experience led you to that belief? What values do you have that underlie that belief? That's modeling curiosity. So again, even if you very much disagree with that person, it does help participants really connect and humanize. And sometimes dramatic shifts can happen when we model curiosity. So a prime example of a dramatic shift is Daryl Davis, the African-American jazz musician, who has modeled curiosity with many, many KKK members, members of the KKK, who, since he is asking them many questions about, what brought you to that belief, that over time, a number of former KKK members have given them their robes in a symbolic gesture of giving up white supremacist ideology, just based on his ability to, instead of coming at them in a very triggered, very kind of aggressive stance, that he's able to humanize them through using some of these practical tools. So it is actually very powerful. What I would say about all these tools is that they're simple tools, but they're not simplistic. And they do require a lot of discipline, actually, to pull them off, a lot of training in terms of knowing yourself, so that you aren't also coming at these difficult conversations from a triggered place. And that leads me to my final tool that I want to discuss before we move into your questions, is to use structure. And I know that at the beginning of the call, you were talking about that a little bit, Dustin and Matt, about the structure, some ideas about the structures you're going to use. At the Zeidler Center, we never have a dialogue, for example, without keeping time, so that each participant has the same amount of time to speak. So we do have facilitators. In one of our primary facilitation methods is a listening circle model. It's not the only method we use, but in these kinds of difficult conversations, it's so common for either the angriest, the loudest, or the most extroverted person in the room to take up more time, and introverted people to not get the same amount of time, that having some facilitator keep time and actually very much describe why they're keeping time, so that there's an equality of time, so everyone can be heard. Even if somebody decides to pass, that's fine. No one is put on the spot to say anything, but that there's that space if they would like to share is really, really important. So that's part of the structure we use. We commonly use this go-around structure where one person is speaking at a time for a set time, responding to a question. So we always start move from more structured to less structured. It's really difficult if you just open it up to anyone and there's kind of like just a kind of, a chaos of people kind of screaming each other down, to then say, okay, now we're going to have a really structured time. That doesn't happen. Whereas if you start tight and, okay, everyone's going to have some time to speak, and then we're going to open it up at the end for just kind of a normal dialogue. What we've seen at the Zeidler Center is that people then get into the habit of civility, where they're really listening deeply to one another, and they've practiced that, and the structure itself lends to that, where it's intentionally slow. It's intentionally using these strategies of breathing, of starting with story, and then what could have been a chaotic debate or argument is really then a transformative dialogue. We never host community dialogues without a set of agreements. We call them communication agreements rather than ground rules. I know that word was tossed out in the beginning, and that's not necessarily a bad word to use. We hear it all the time. But we have had participants be very triggered. And again, the point is not to trigger people by the word rule. The word rule in our society tends to be negatively connotated. And some participants, especially in really challenging dialogues, they say, well, these rules aren't mine. Don't make me, follow. I'm not going to follow your rules. And when you throw out even the word rule, people tend to say, rules are made to be broken. So, but rather, if you talk about agreements and you actually give people a draft list of agreements and allow some space for them to change them, add to them, and make them their own, then it is actually a participant agreement. And so that's an important, it's not something that I'm putting on you, it's something that you're agreeing to for the space of this dialogue. And we've got a lot of examples of agreements that we've used, draft lists and things. The structure.
Excuse me, I had to sneeze.
Oh, no problem.
I've been sneezing for 3 weeks, but go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Haven't we all? And lastly, one of the key things that we do is and part of partnering with us is that we bring or train professional facilitators. So we offer the facilitator trainings all over, and then we also facilitate using professional facilitators. So the idea there is that these are people that aren't participating in the dialogue. They're not there to give their personal opinion. They're there to hold the space and to redirect people in very skillful ways when they break their agreements. Because what we have found is that given human nature, people will agree to agreements, and about 30 seconds after they agree to agreements, they'll start breaking the agreement. And it doesn't mean that they're bad people. It just means that we're not used to having this kind of dialogue. We're not used to sticking with agreements. And so one of the agreements that we have usually in every dialogue is, I speak for myself, for my personal experience. I won't try to speak for a whole group, and I won't ask others to speak for, defend, or explain an entire group of people. That's a really, really important one, especially for minority voices, people of color. Somebody asking, well, what do all African American people think about blah, blah, blah? Very common question that is actually very unfair, puts people in a really awkward position to speak for a whole group of people. Same with political dialogue. Well, why do Republicans do this or that? It's not fair to ask people to speak for a whole group. And again, those kinds of comments can lead to a very triggered, again, debate. Whereas if you ask people to use I statements and speak from their experience maybe as a member of their group, but their experience in their group, that's really important. But having that trained facilitator in their group, we would say is really, really important. The idea that we speak like I'm speaking all the time. I'm using the royal we. And when people speak like this, it again is triggering, and it's really easy. Even if people say, yes, I agree to the agreement, using I statement, speaking for ourselves, if we all just followed that agreement, we would be in a better space. And so they're starting to use a we statement right away after they agreed to that agreement. So again, the role of good facilitation is the idea that that the facilitators help hold the space, help people remind people of their agreements. They keep time, and oftentimes they'll take notes. So we do sometimes do pre-post surveys to assess change over time. That's something that you can do. So a scale of 1 to 10, I am comfortable having community conversations with people who disagree with me. Or, 1 being totally disagree, 10 being totally agree. And you can assess change in the whole group. That's just a sample question. Pre and post surveys having the same question before and after. But our facilitators are trained to take anonymous notes on what each individual person says. And so we'll produce reports afterwards that are very detailed, qualitative and quantitative data on all of the ideas and all of the concerns that come out of a single dialogue, and that can be really helpful to conveners. So I know that I'm going to